All rise, please. Welcome to day 3 of evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez and I am the hearings manager. There is no fire alarm testing expected today, so if the fire alarm goes off, please follow the fire exit signs and make your way to the muster point, which is the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On arrival at the muster point, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and who will be keeping a register of all attendees. The fire marshals will also be responsible for letting everyone know when it is safe to return in liaison with representatives from the Thistle Hotel. I now hand over to the Chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start today's proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. Those in the public area will know what I'm about to say. I apologise to you if you've heard it before, but it's important that everybody there understands. Anyone who's brought a mobile device into the hearing room is perfectly free to use it to communicate silently with the outside world what they are seeing and hearing in the hearing room, but only after 10 minutes have elapsed since the event that you are describing. And those devices may not be used to record or photograph what is going on here. Thank you. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, sir. This morning I'll be summarising the evidence of HN 3095 William Anthony Furner. William Furner, known as Bill Furner, worked in the back office management of the SDS as a detective constable from its formation in 1968 to late 1970. He has provided 2 witness statements to the inquiry. The first, dated the 1st of October 2019, served to exhibit 15 photographs provided by Bill Furner to the inquiry of former members of the SDS. These pictures were believed to have been taken at a Christmas party held in November 1968, and Bill Furner has assisted in identifying the people pictured. The second statement is dated the 18th of September 2020 and can be summarised as follows. Bill Furner joined the Metropolitan Police in 1964, moving to Special Branch at the start of 1968. He was part of the first group of officers brought on to assist the SDS at its inception, joining at the rank of Detective Constable. He states that he was told to report to Conrad Dixon, who explained that the SDS was to infiltrate left-wing organisations who were involved in the Vietnam War protests and to obtain information about their activities and intentions. There was no selection process for the SDS, nor was his involvement a matter of choice. Quote, "They told me I was a member of the team, and that was it. I accepted it as normal routine." End quote. He also confirms that there was no training for the role. Bill Furner's role was administrative, working from the back office in Scotland Yard and dealing with the paperwork that came in. He describes his responsibilities as checking rent books, checking and submitting officers' diaries, and ensuring that expenses were paid. He states that he did not play any part in tasking or steering undercover officers, procuring or administering the safe houses, or obtaining cover documents, accommodation, or vehicles for the deployed officers. With regard to expenses, Furner explains that he would check undercover officers' diaries and ensure the accuracy of the sums before submitting them. There was no set routine whereby officers had to submit diaries on a particular day, but he recalls being given them weekly, whether at the SDS flat or if officers came to Scotland Yard. He notes that the diary system was common throughout CID. Bill Furner was based in Scotland Yard, but would attend the Safe House in West London for regular meetings. He states that there was no set pattern as to when these meetings were to be held, but, quote, "If something cropped up that everyone had to be involved in, we met up at the flat." Officers would hand in their reporting at these meetings, and there would be general discussion about who would attend specific meetings and demonstrations based on the intelligence provided. The undercover officers would occasionally come to Scotland Yard. On average, Furner states that he would see the officers about once a week, but this became less frequent towards the end of his time in the SDS because the risks of being seen coming into the yard were considered greater as deployments were underway. He states, quote, "I only interacted with the undercover officers insofar as they would hand me their diaries and we would talk. I knew from their records and from talking to them the organizations and personalities they were involved with, but they never discussed with me in any detail what they were doing or who they met." Bill Furner affirms in his witness statement that he was not involved in the filing or writing up intelligence reports from undercover officers, and states that it would have been HN 1251 Phil Saunders who dealt with the paper intelligence. To his knowledge, officers would provide both written and verbal reports during their regular safe house meetings, which would be brought back to Scotland Yard. He believes the reports were written up before being passed on to Conrad Dixon, who he presumes would pass them on to Chief Superintendent Arthur Cunningham and the Assistant Commissioner of Crime. He is only able to speculate on where the reports were disseminated, but states that he understood that the reports went as high as the Home Office. Bill Furner recalls his direct line managers as being Chief Inspector Conrad Dixon, the head of the SDS, and DI Phil Saunders, the second in command, with DI Ryby Wilson also holding a management position. He states that all three joined organizations, though Furner cannot remember what they were. Phil Saunders spent the most time in the back office and contributed towards the administration of the SDS alongside Bill Furner and DS Roy Creamer. Furner describes the SDS as, quote, "hardly a rank-conscious organization," and confirms that he had a lot of personal interactions with Conrad Dixon. His closest working colleagues were D.I. Saunders and D.S. Creamer, as they were all posted in the office together. Bill Furner states that he had done no undercover policing or used a cover identity prior to joining the SDS. Although his role was administrative, there were occasions where he did attend meetings or demonstrations and reported back. He states that he attended very few activists' meetings, but can remember attending several large demonstrations, for example, at Trafalgar Square and at Twickenham. These would be occasions where he was told to attend. He states that he did not use a cover name and only attended as a member of the audience to take notes or to mingle with the crowd at a demonstration. He would wear, quote, "a scruffy coat," but would not otherwise change his appearance. He did not join any organizations. Bill Furner states that a major part of his job was reading information from the security service. It was his responsibility to go through information provided by the security service on groups of common interest between them and the SDS, and extract relevant details and file them. Despite this, he states that he had no direct contact or dealings with the security service while on the SDS. He believes that the security service would have made requests for intelligence, but did not deal with that personally. Furner recalls that officers would have spent time preparing for their deployments, but he did not know what they would do or how long they would have had spent preparing. He knew they were being briefed and told what to look out for before being sent out of the main office to join a group. He did not know beforehand which groups were to be infiltrated, as it was not a topic that was discussed openly. He cannot comment as to whether officers spent time in the back office following their withdrawals. Bill Furner states that he was not aware of any unhappy working relationships between members of the SDS and considered it a well-run squad. To his knowledge, none of his contemporaries provoked or encouraged a third party to commit a criminal offence, engaged in sexual activity whilst in their cover identity, were arrested, tried, or convicted in their cover identity, were involved in incidents of public order or violence, reported on any legally privileged information, or reported on the activities of elected politicians. He recalls one instance where a member of the SDS may have been involved in committing a criminal offence, but the matter did not go to court and the officer was not charged with any offence. When asked about what the SDS achieved for policing, Bill Furner notes that the squad was able to provide uniformed police with threat assessments or other forecasts in relation to the likely numbers or moods of those attending upcoming public events. He states that the undercover deployments, quote, meant that we had the people under constant observation, meant that we had the people under observation and different organizations completely and utterly tapped. They did not make a move that we did not know about, end quote. He recalls one particular incident where it was discovered that a group intended to chain themselves to the rugby posts at Twickenham, and the uniformed police were forewarned to turn up with bolt cutters, which avoided any significant disruption. With regards to senior management, Bill Furner remembers one time where the Assistant Chief Commissioner of Crime visited the SDS before the 1968 October demonstration and spoke to undercover officers about the work being done. On this occasion, Furner recalls driving the Assistant Chief Commissioner to and from the SDS safe house for the meeting. He also recalls that Conrad Dixon did have an interview with Jim Callahan, the then Home Secretary, at least once. Bill Furner left the Metropolitan Police in September 1970 to take up a job at the Ministry of Defence. The SDS was his final posting. So that concludes the summary of the statements of Bill Furner. The documents related to that officer will be published on the inquiry's website today, along with documents for 4 other individuals. They are HN 325 Conrad Dixon, who was the head of the SDS from July 1968 to July 1969. PN 1748 Ryby Wilson, who was Detective Inspector of the SDS from July 1968 to May 1970. HN 1251 Phil Saunders, who was Detective Inspector and Second in Command of the SDS from July 1968, and head of the SDS between November 1969 and August 1971. And finally, for HN 474 Wilf Knight, who was involved in the documentary True Spies. Thank you, sir.
Yes. And all of these 4 individuals have died, and so all we have of theirs is their documents.
I believe that's correct, yes,
Thank
sir.
you. Now, we are now going to hear from a live witness, are we not? And we will need 10 minutes, I think, to get everything set up to permit that to happen.
All rise, please.
I understand that you wish to be sworn.
I do.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Fernandez.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Warner.
Mr. Smith, I think it's right that you gave the inquiry a witness statement already, dated the 2nd of December 2020. Can I ask you firstly, please, to confirm that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is indeed, yes.
Now, Mr. Smith, you have told us that you were a back office sergeant within the SDS from about October 1970 to October 1974. Is that right?
That's about right, yes.
The first topic I'd like to ask you about, please, is training. And the first aspect of that is the training that you personally were given when you joined the SDS. You told us in your statement that not very much specific to the SDS was given to you, and that to some extent it was your special branch training was relevant to that role. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
We'll come on to special branch training in just a moment, but just in terms of when you started on the SDS, are you able to recall whether you were given an induction of any kind?
Obviously, I would have been told about the structure of the squad and who was on it and what we did and what I was being expected to do. Essentially, I was told to process the information that was being brought and put it into a format which was would then go back into the system. But having been in Special Branch then for 8 years, I was well versed in the reports and the things that we did, and the nature of the reports that were coming through from the officers was no different in practice to what other officers would be doing when they were doing things overtly. It was day date, time and place, and that was it, you know. So that wasn't difficult in any shape or form.
So is it fair to say that most of the guidance you would have given would have been on practical things? And how to do your
Simply,
job?
the guidance was, well, who was out on the squad and what they were doing, but no actual... I didn't need any guidance, as I saw it, or as I perceived it, on dealing with the paperwork. I knew where it had to go instinctively because I'd been in, as I say, in the branch for 8 years at that stage. It wasn't as if I was a rookie sort of coming in totally blind.
Right. We'll come on to that aspect in just a moment. Is it likely that Phil Saunders was the person that introduced you in this way?
He was the one who, in fact, approached me to join.
I see. And in terms of your position on the squad, is it right that it's any other guidance or training you were given was on the job as issues arose?
Yes, I mean, one of the good things was that there was the chief inspector, the inspector, myself, and a DC or someone who was on the point of going into the squad or coming off the squad were in the office, and we were all in the same office together. It wasn't as if we were separated into a couple of offices. So if you had a problem or you had a question, you just simply could ask them and say, look, what about this, what about that? I mean, so it was very easy in that respect.
And is that something you did while you were on the SDS?
I would have done it. Yes, I don't specifically remember an instance of saying, what about this or what about that, but logic and common sense dictates I would have done that.
I see. Can I ask you, please, just a bit more generally about your special branch training? Now, you told us you, I think, joined special branch about 8 years or so before moving on to the SDS.
Yes.
Presumably, you would have been given some training when you joined special branch.
Yes, again, it's sort of all linked into really, when one starts as a PC, you learn this, as I call, day, date, time, and place type of writing reports. And when I started on the naturalisation section, where basically you were interviewing people who wanted to become British and who were, in the main, people from Poland, Hungary, that sort of neck of the woods. And the people around you in the office gave you advice and said, look, and they told you the format of the report and the things you needed to cover. And then, I suppose to some extent it was experience and trial and error. I mean, but you did these reports, that was it. And then I did that for a year or so, and then I went on to mainstream SB work.
If I can just ask you a little bit more specifically, when you actually joined Special Branch, do you remember an overall training course being given to you?
No.
You just joined a squad?
No, just joined the squad, and then someone would have given me some sort of briefing, probably at Chief Inspector level, as to what was expected of me.
When you joined Special Branch, do you remember, either on the squad or more generally, do you remember any training being given to you on the legal limits of police powers?
No, no. It was, I suppose, common sense was the best thing that I could say that you followed. You knew what was illegal and what wasn't illegal.
Did you have any training perhaps on that topic when you joined the police as a constable, something like that?
There would have been, I suppose. Let's say that was, 60 years ago.
I appreciate I'm asking you to remember a long time ago.
I went to detective training school whilst I was in the Special Branch, and obviously that would have covered aspects of that at that time, and that was I think about a 3-month course or so.
I see. So you would have presumably been aware of things like limits on the police powers to enter and search property, things like that.
Search warrants
and things like that. And now, when you were on the SDS, was any consideration, conversation about those legal limits applied to the SDS's work? Do you remember?
Well, I could remember vividly that the thing that was hammered home was not to act as agent provocateur. That was for the officers.
Yes.
I think probably it may help to sort of explain that one of the nature of the job was to be on demonstrations and obviously get information which would help us to police things much better. But the trouble is, if you're going out on demonstrations, with the best will in the world, there's going to be a small risk that you may get arrested for obstruction, for example, because you're with everyone else. Because if you didn't go out on the demonstrations, then what was the point of being undercover anyway?
Yes.
And so it was part and parcel, albeit a small risk. Once in a blue moon, someone might find themselves arrested for obstruction, but that was about the limit of things.
I understand that. We'll come on to that
Sure.
in a bit more detail in a moment. I just, before we do, wanted to ask you whether specifically the police's powers to enter property, whether that was thought about on the
I
SDS.
can't remember that being mentioned at all.
Okay. Equally, there were, of course, police disciplinary regulations that applied to all police officers at the time, weren't there? I think you mentioned them in your statement as a large tome.
Yes, it's very
large.
It was very big, yes.
And presumably you were aware that things like discreditable conduct were covered in...
Yeah, it was all straightforward. I don't think there was anything complicated about it.
And you were aware, presumably, that things like that would have applied to SDS officers' activities?
Yes, they had to use their common sense in terms of what was possible and if they had a problem, then one would expect them to tell their supervising officers.
I see. Now, do you ever recall having conversations with any of the deployed officers about things like discreditable conduct or anything like that, or did you just expect them to use their training?
No, I didn't have direct conversations with them about that. It was very much the domain of the Chief Inspector and the Inspector. But obviously the lad who was in the office with me, who quite often was one who was about to go out into the field, then I would have shown him the reports that were coming in so he gets a feel of it all. So there was an element of talk about that, yes.
But not necessarily about
the
specifics
how
of the
they should
discipline.
behave, no.
Finally, on this point, Mr. Smith, was legal advice ever available to you when you were on the SDS?
I suppose it was available. I never had occasion to take advantage of it.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the training that officers were given, and you've mentioned a little about it before. And you've told us in your statement that really agent provocateur was quite an important part
That
of
was
what
the
was drilled
major
into them.
thrust of this.
Was this training that, or guidance, if I put it that way, that you would have given to new recruits to the SDS?
I may have mentioned it, but I wouldn't have. I would have just mentioned it rather than being the one to actually give them that advice, if you follow me. There's a difference between sort of saying, oh, well, you know, just a casual comment, as it were, but the actual advice was given by the two, the inspector and the chief inspector.
So is it fair to say you would have taken your lead from the detective inspector?
Yes. Right. It was common knowledge that that was the main thing, is that basically we wanted them to be a fly on the wall, not to be taking a leading part in things.
And why was it such a concern, this aspect of them taking a leading role? Why was it?
Because
of
obviously
concern?
that would have been improper. I mean, because then if people suddenly start getting arrested and police officers were in fact the ones that had instigated the problem, then that would create all sorts of complications and would have been, you know, illegal and wrong, just pure and simple.
Can I ask you to look at a document, please, and it will come up on the screen in front of you, so
Yes.
you don't need to do anything. It's MPS-07-27104. This is a document, Mr. Smith, which was issued by the Home Office on this very topic, just 18 months or so before you joined the SDS.
Yes.
Is this a document that you were familiar with?
No,
And
I haven't seen it before,
had you
to
seen
my
it
knowledge.
before? I see. And can you scroll down? Can we scroll down to the bottom of the first page, please? Thank you. Really, the guidance is, as you will see by number 3A, no member of a police force or police informant should counsel, incite or procure the commission of a crime.
Yes.
And is that, in a nutshell,
Yes.
what you were
Yes.
aware of? Thank you. That can come down now, please. Just before we move on, you've mentioned police officers encouraging crime being a real concern. What about police officers becoming involved in criminal acts? Was that a concern too?
Not at that stage. I think the nature of the demonstrations in those early days was mainly, I think it was when things like animal rights came in, where it was a much more anarchistic, dare I say, setup. But in the formal setups of the organisations that were there in that period, 70-74, then you had a leadership of the organisation which was defined, and therefore the rank and file would, dare I say it, turn up at a meeting on a Wednesday or Thursday and be told that this weekend we've got a 3-line whip on a demonstration, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. We want as many to support this as possible. And of course it was that giving of that information that was then put into the system, which enabled ultimately our uniform colleagues to be better placed to deal with and cope with the situation.
The other aspect of guidance that you mentioned within your statement is that officers shouldn't get too involved with individuals in the groups that they were deployed on. You mentioned that in your statement. I just wanted to explore what was the thinking, your thinking, behind that guidance?
Well, I think the trouble is that the more you become involved and the more close you become to someone, then there's a greater risk of you letting slip something or being lulled into a false sense of security and saying something which could lead to your, dare I say, your exposure as a police officer.
So is it fair to say it's a risk of compromise?
Indeed, yes. And it's a balance. You have to obviously join in, be a part of things, but you have to be disciplined in how far things go, because, as I say, the deeper the relationship becomes, then the more difficult it becomes.
Was any concern behind this in terms of officers developing close relationships with the people they were reporting on?
I don't remember it specifically being caught in that sense. I mean, It was just, at that stage, I mean, I wasn't aware of, dare I say it, the things that emerged later. That aspect I wasn't aware of at all. It was never mentioned. But it was just common sense that you didn't get too deeply involved. As I'm talking of friendship with people, you know.
Yes.
You'd have a mate who you'd meet and be fine. But you would, the nature of the work was that you didn't want to divulge too much about yourself, but had to have sufficient to be credible. And you didn't ask questions. And the beauty was that if you weren't asking questions of people, they weren't asking questions of you, because it's a natural thing. If people are open with you, you will be open with them. And it's a vice versa thing.
As you've mentioned it, you also mentioned in your statement that you considered that it was obvious that this guidance would have extended to intimate relationships.
Oh yes, by implication. I mean, common sense.
Well,
Yes.
that's my question really. What was
Sorry.
this implied, or was it ever expressly said?
Never expressed, no. I never heard problem being mentioned about that aspect of the job, of that undercover work. In fact, casting my mind back, I think it's true to say, I mean, later on that it would have changed, but in those days the numbers of women, dare I say, who were involved in extremist activity was very small. There were women involved in the women's liberation thing, and that was almost exclusively, if not exclusively, women. But the numbers of women involved in demonstrations and all that were much less in those days. I suppose, I don't know why, but that was just a fact of life.
The fact that the implication that this guidance would have also included intimate relationships, is that something you thought at the time, or something you have thought since?
It didn't occur to me about that. It was simply just, you've got to be careful. It's a bit like telling a police officer not to commit crime or not to assault people or whatever. It's a common sense thing that it's a risk, which obviously to themselves and indeed to the whole existence of the squad.
Do you think it's fair to say that management on the SDS, when you were involved in it, were aware that there must have been very close personal relationships, not necessarily sexual, but certainly close personal relationships, being formed between the UCOs and those they were reporting on?
It's possible. I mean, it was inevitable that something along those lines would have happened, but the idea was to keep that thing to a minimum, I would say. But I wasn't involved in that side of the conversation with the individuals in the way that the inspector and the chief inspector was. All I was getting peripheral bits. I was interested in the information that the lads were providing to me, so I could then process it and put it into the system.
Well, we will come on to that.
Surely, yes.
Just before we do, the guidance both on agent provocateur and not getting too involved with those in the groups, would that have been given to everyone that came through the door?
Oh, yes, I'm sure it was, yes.
Was there any training or guidance, rather, given to new UCOs on how to perhaps limit their involvement in other people's
I'm not aware particularly of that, no. I mean, I think it was more, the conversations would have been more at a sort of common sense level rather than training per se, they'd have had a chat about what they've got to do, what they shouldn't do. And of course the officers, most of them would have been in Special Branch for 3 or 4 years beforehand. So a lot of the sort of awareness of these things would have already been assimilated by then. So it wasn't as if you're sort of teaching young rookies off the street, as it were, what to do and how to do it.
I see. Positions of responsibility. A number of the officers, certainly after you were involved in the unit, obtained positions of responsibility within the groups that they were reporting on. Yeah. Was there any concern that you recall amongst the management of the unit about officers doing that?
No, I can't remember anyone having positions of responsibility, to be honest. As I said, I think when the organisations were more clearly defined and had a structure, it was fine. The problem arose, I suspect, was when you're getting into what I call the more anarchistic setups, where everybody was an individual and a law unto themselves, in a sense. And so that made, dare I say it, the job of getting the intelligence more difficult. But I don't remember anyone being secretary or chairman or whatever of any group, no.
Can we take it from that then that there was no guidance given to the officers about whether they should or shouldn't do it?
I don't know. I can't say it was or there wasn't, but because, as I said, I wasn't involved in that side of things.
Thank you. The back office, which you have
Yes.
already mentioned, you've told us that new UCOs would tend to spend 4 to 6 weeks in the office and meet some of the deployed officers as well and read their reports. Was this the method that the STS was using when you joined in 1970?
It was, yes. It was only after about 2 or 3 years that we started to get a permanent DC from elsewhere within the branch who hadn't been out in the field or wasn't about to go in the field doing that role. That happened about 1973, I suppose. But I dates and that I'm not too sure on.
I understand. You've mentioned in your statement that the purpose really of this was to learn about targets and methodology.
Yeah.
Now, if I can deal with targets first, what sort of thing were they taught about targets? Can you remember?
Well, by targets, I mean, what sort of organisations were there? I mean, that was decided really by the Chief Inspector and the Inspector, on advice, dare I say it, from the rest of the branch. Because these things aren't static. I mean, you had certain organisations which were common pretty well throughout, but others sort of came and went a bit. And so what you did was you adjusted, dare I say, our coverage of these things accordingly. And yeah, that was the way it was. It was something that just naturally evolved.
Was this process supervised by you?
By the process of
The learning about targets?
No, that wasn't supervised by me. I was aware of, obviously, who the targets were. I suppose the better way I can describe it is that when I was a chief inspector, I was aware of right-wing elements and the need perhaps for the SDS to cover that because they hadn't posed a problem before. But I said, look, I think there's an argument, and I put up an argument, and ultimately that's what happens. So what happens is that when events happen and organisations come to the fore, then you say, well, hey, should we be covering these, and is it appropriate we cover these for the SDS? And then that paper would get put up through to Chief Superintendent or Commander level, and they would then obviously, go across to the squad and say, yes, we'll, this is what we'll do, or not. Well, they would do it, obviously.
Just focusing on what new officers would have been told about targets at this point. Do you remember what sort of thing they might have been told about the groups that those above you, or perhaps you, wanted them to target? Yeah,
I think it's true to say that having been in Special Branch, most of them, as I said, 3 or 4 years, they would have had a fair idea themselves of the organisation we're talking about. And they would have been told the organisation, which, dare I say it, they were being earmarked for, because what you had was like a rolling programme. As one man went off of an organisation, someone else would be coming in, as it were, or they may overlap for a short time. And then, of course, the man who was coming off could give them very valuable information, and probably the most valuable information about that organisation. And, of course, in the interim, the lad would see the reports that were coming in from that source to assist them in what needed to be done. But it wasn't complicated stuff. I mean, basically, it was just saying, well, what we wanted to do was to find out what was the strength of the organisation, what were they planning to do, and when were they planning to do it. And that was fairly straightforward. It wasn't some sort of rocket science thing, dare I say. It was straightforward, and they were well used to reporting that sort of thing previously, so it wasn't a great steep learning curve. The best thing was the advice that they were getting from the Chief Inspector and the Inspector about what to do, how to do it, and from, dare I say, their colleagues on the squad who told them, dare I say, the ring craft.
I see. Well, coming on to that, the other aspect that you mentioned in your statement is methodology. Now, I don't want you to go into any detail, please, but can we take it from that you're talking about tradecraft?
Yes, yeah.
About how to sustain their undercover identities?
Yes, what to do and what not to do more precisely.
You mentioned also viewing reporting from those that perhaps they were following into the field or were there already otherwise.
Yeah.
Were the new officers being encouraged to follow the patterns in reporting, sort of things that you've mentioned that might be interested in them of their predecessors?
Yeah, so they would do that naturally. As I said, it followed on from the old, what I called the day, date, time and place thing. You simply said, this is what it's about, and this is what happened, this is who said that. As a summary, you did get absolute chapter and verse, obviously, on things, but what it did was gave a picture of the organisation at that time.
Thank you. Can we move on, please, to Special Branch and where the SDS sat within Special Branch? I'd like you to look at a document, please. It's MPS-07-37401. If we could just, you can see that this is, thank you, a document entitled The Evaluation of Special Branch. And at the bottom of the page, it's dated July 1973. So it's while you were within the SDS. And if we could scroll to the second page, please. Thank you. We can see that the first top half of the page is it is suggested to be the current structure of, I think, C Squad within Special Branch.
Yes.
And we can see that the Special Demonstration Squad sits underneath a Chief Inspector, who in turn sits underneath a Superintendent and a Chief Superintendent. Is that your recollection around sort of summer of 1973 of how the SDS sat within Special Branch?
Yes, and one of the I must confess, the first sight I was thinking, oh, 4 inspectors, it didn't make sense. But then I realised in one of the lads in the field was in fact an inspector, which was unusual, but he was.
Well, we don't need to hear anything
That's
about
okay.
that. Let's just focus on where the squad, the SDS sat within Special Branch. We know that the SDS became part of C Squad in perhaps late 1972 or 1973. Does that accord with your recollection?
I can't remember that, to be honest. No.
I see. And it later became part of S Squad in about the summer of 1974. But this document seems to be suggesting a proposal, whilst it was within C Squad, to change the SDS to sit underneath a superintendent. If you look towards the bottom half of the diagram,
Yes.
you can see that the proposal is that the SDS moves to report into a superintendent rather than a chief inspector. Do you recall that ever happening?
No, to my recollection, the time I was there, it was always a chief inspector.
I see. The other question I wanted to ask you about this document is on the very far left of both of the proposal and the current structure, you can see what it says, SEC Service Inspector. Can you see that?
Yes.
Which we assume may be Security Service Inspector. We're not sure. Are you able to help us with what role that person did?
It doesn't ring a bell with me at all, I must confess, no. I assume that the aide to CID Chief Inspector or aide might have been on the bomb squad or something like that, but no, I can't. I don't know. SEC? No.
Thank you. Now, as I mentioned, in 1974, the SDS moved from C Squad to S Squad. Can you recall that happening?
No, I don't know.
The reason I ask is there is a suggestion within the SDS annual report for that year that this allowed for greater cooperation within the squads, but presumably you can't help us whether that was right or not.
No. I think it was logical for it to be under C Squad only because, well, primarily because 80% of the product went to C Squad. It was of their interest. So, I mean, that sort of was logical in that sense.
Thank you. This document can come down now. More generally, how much control, if I can put it that way, was there over the SDS by Special Branch when you were in the unit?
I think it's true to say that the primary control and the major control was at Chief Inspector and Inspector level. Because of the nature of the work, you had to rely upon those two very heavily because senior officers couldn't be going to see these people all the time or hardly at all for security reasons. So there was great emphasis, I think, put upon the selection of the people to do that role because it was so important. Because you had to rely upon those two to do the supervision. In parallel with that, however, it was true to say that being 12 people together, there was, dare I say it, a mutual support system there by accident almost. It wasn't necessarily by design, but the fact there were 12 of them, there was a great sense of camaraderie amongst them, which definitely was beneficial to the squad. And if someone felt there was a problem with one of the lads, he would undoubtedly have said it to the inspector and the chief inspector if they weren't aware of it.
Would you include yourself within that?
To a degree, yes, but if the inspector and the chief inspector weren't around, then, you know, it would fall to me. I mean, in fact, it did on one occasion, famously.
We will come on to that.
Or whatever. Yes.
You may or may not be able to help us with this, but if a problem had arisen and the chief inspector or inspector were aware, do you know whether a problem might be escalated to those superior to them?
Well, no, in the first instance, they would come to me because I was the one person in the office who would then have natural access. I could then go along and see, you know, the appropriate chief superintendent, commander, whatever, and praise him instantly of what the problem was.
I see. Knowledge of the SDS, that's the next topic I'd like to ask you about, please. You told us within your statement that knowledge of the Harries, as they were known, was very high within Special Branch.
Yes, it was, yes.
And you said that you knew that they, before you joined, I should say, you knew that they were providing intelligence on public order. Does it follow from that you knew or suspected which type of groups they were reporting on?
I would have had a fair idea because it was unavoidable. One knew the people who were demonstrating because we were covering those demonstrations overtly anyway. Prior to the SDS, then the threat assessments, which are so, dare I say, valuably assisted by the SDS, but prior to that, then it was the lads on the ordinary squads that were preparing those assessments, so that they were well aware of those organisations by nature, by the very nature of things.
Would you have been aware, for instance, that most of the groups being reported on were left-wing groups?
The vast majority, yes.
And you would have been aware of that before?
Oh, yes.
And can you assist us perhaps with why, when you joined certainly, there was such a focus on
Well,
these
the
groups?
vast majority of the people who were demonstrating were left-wing. As I said, I alluded to the right-wing. The National Front at that time was really quite small. I mean, it got a bit of a profile, but it was very small. But the right-wing, the left-wing were the ones who were demonstrating. What had happened was that in '68, throughout Europe, there'd been this upsurge in extreme left-wing demonstrating and everything, and we weren't immune from it. And that's what happened. And it started, as you know, with the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, which was essentially a left-wing, extreme left-wing organisation. And so that was where the emphasis was, because these were the people who were demonstrating.
After you left the unit and returned to Special Branch,
Yes.
did you get the impression that the state of knowledge amongst Special Branch officers of the SDS had changed at all? Was it still pretty commonly known about?
Oh, it was commonly known about. Yeah. Oh, yes. There's no question about that.
And it'd be fair to say that the SDS, the existence of the SDS, though perhaps not specifics, was a pretty open secret within Special Branch.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Turning to the SDS itself, you've told us in your statement and in fact today that its primary purpose was, as you understood it, to gain intelligence on public order and demonstrations. You joined in 1970, which was about 2 years or so after it had been set up, maybe a little longer. When you joined the SDS, did you understand it to be a permanent unit?
Yes. Well, it was subject to annual review. I knew that. But it was a well-established unit by then, yes. I mean, I thought, well, this will obviously go on as long as it remained a secret, dare I say.
While you were there, did you ever consider that there was a chance it might not continue? Was its existence in jeopardy from those on high? Can you recall?
Not from those on high, because I think it was true to say that because those on high had been consulted and knew all about it, and the Home Office knew about it. I mean, the Commissioner himself had actually visited on one occasion, so it wasn't a question of nobody could ever say that. So I think, and also too, the relationship, dare I say, with our uniform colleagues in A8, which may be a different number now, was very, very good. And in no small part, it's because we were able to give them very good threat assessments on what was happening in respect of demonstrations. So I think that the benefits of the squad were well known, and there wasn't, the danger to the squad was if it became known outside, and obviously that would make its continued existence much more difficult and problematic.
Can we take it from that you don't recall any conversations happening about the SDS being curtailed, its existence?
No. There was an annual report, and we'd have been surprised, dare I say it, if we'd have been refused, because it was becoming a regular thing, but things hadn't changed and nothing had happened to cause us to think otherwise.
Now, you mentioned the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and the October demonstrations in 1968 yes. being the start of yes. the SDS. We know that certainly those deployments didn't involve particularly long-term infiltrations of groups. No. But by the time you had joined the unit about 2 years later, these longer-term deployments had begun. Are you able to help us with why things changed? Well,
I think the problem initially was that there'd been a demonstration in the spring of '68, which was quite nasty and almost involved in an invasion of the US Embassy, which would have been disastrous. And there was another one scheduled for the autumn, the October. And it was realized that we needed to get far better intelligence. And so, obviously, as a short-term thing, well, what we've got to do is infiltrate the VSC or people who are associated with that. And that led on, I think, naturally to a slightly wider coverage of the groups. And by definition, by the end of '68, nobody had been in the group more than 6 months. But it then naturally followed on that slowly but surely, the sort of tenure of people in groups and all that, it just naturally developed. Because there was no rush after that point. There would have been a rush initially to get people in because time was pressing. 6 months' time, we were going to get this major demonstration. And I expect the decision to form the squad was a month or so down the line. But as things went on, then obviously you have more time and you can then do things. And people weren't rushed into organisations at all. It would take a month, 2, 3 months, whatever, even longer, to get established in a group. And that was a very gentle process because that was less risk to the individual and indeed to the organisation. And so that what you had was a rolling programme of people joining these organisations. And at any one time, 10 or 11 would be fully active and 1 or 2 would be sort of in the process of coming in, perhaps.
So is it fair to say you suspect that one thing led to the other naturally?
Yes, it did, yes. It was obviously proven to be very effective. And if something's proven to be effective, you don't say, well, let's get rid of it.
Can we move on, please, to an essay that you wrote in 1979.
Yes.
We'll bring it up on the screen just so
Oh,
it's
sure.
there. It's MPS-0747444. Page 2 to start with. Thank you. This is an essay which you've told us you wrote for a training course you did in 1979.
Yes.
And it reviews the public order scene, if I can put it that way, and policing of it in the 1970s. Firstly, can you remember what training course you would have prepared this?
It was
for?
Bram's Hill course, Inspector's Bram's Hill course.
Firstly, the context. How much of a concern were the demonstrations which took place in the 1970s to Special Branch?
Well, they were concerned because obviously there was the potential for a public disorder, and there was disorder from time to time. And one of the primary roles of police is protection of public, preservation of public order. And so it was perfectly natural for us to be concerned with that, and how best can we get information on that.
Can we look, please, at a small section of it? It's page 5, please.
Okay.
The bottom of the page. Now, I'm going to read a small section out.
Sure.
Where you deal with police intelligence on demonstrations. At the bottom of the page, it is a truism that full and prior knowledge of extremist plans for demonstrations is the cornerstone for police success in planning for demonstrations. Fortunately, our liberal democratic system, which positively encourages demonstrations, is ultimately our best weapon for obtaining intelligence. Only rarely do the extremists formulate their plans in total secrecy, and normally, albeit grudgingly, they will supply to the police the broad outline of their intentions. Additionally, the need to enlist support for any event necessitates publicity, usually by leaflet, advertisements, in sympathetic publications, and publicity in the newspaper of the organising group. In more authoritarian countries, where the underground system is by necessity more widespread, it is possible to raise significant support in secret. But in this country, other than for small sit-ins or pickets, it is virtually impossible to do so. Is what you've written there your view now?
I think to some extent what I was trying to do was to, dare I say, I realised that I couldn't talk about the SDS and I didn't want to talk about the SDS, so I, dare I say, downplayed that aspect. Because I thought, well, look, it'd be very easy. I could quite easily talk about things which would imply that we had the SDS. I didn't want to do that, but I had to somehow, in dealing with that subject, I have to get round that problem, dare I say, if you're going to talk about demonstrations. But the reality is, it was the very small ones, the very secret ones, which were the tricky ones in some respects. But what the great thing about the SDS was that you were able to, because you had the extra intelligence, you then had a better grasp of the feel and the strength of the organisations. So that if, for example, you prior to 1968, you would turn around and say on a threat assessment, well, there'll probably be between 1,000 and 2,000 people and whatever, and the possibility of violence exists, sort of. All rather general stuff. With the existence of the SDS, you would say, look, intelligence suggests we will have 1,250 on this demonstration. There is a small risk of disorder, but it's not that high. But you could be far more precise in that, and what it meant. And as our uniformed colleagues became far more trusting, dare I say, and were aware that our threat assessments were on the button, then they could deploy their people far more accurately and indeed not have a lot of wastage of police because they didn't need colossal reserves. And the beauty is what reserves they did have would be dispositioned in the right place. So we were both saving money and indeed making a more efficient, and it was making 10, 15, 20% difference or whatever it is. So the whole thing was cost effective and effective in public order control terms.
We will come on to threat
Sorry.
assessments, and it is only right to say that you do go on later in the next paragraph to talk about special branch sources, which
Yeah.
we will come to. But just before we do, I understand what you say, that you couldn't mention the SDS in this. But what I'm interested to explore is, if this much information is available freely, as you mentioned there, why was the SDS a necessity in your view?
It just sharpened it up that much more, that was all. I mean, you could get a fair, when you were well experienced, you could get a fair amount of information. But what we did find, and I think it is true to say, is that whereas a lot of organisations were compliant or helpful to police and would report what they were going to do, a lot of these extreme organisations weren't as compliant. So we needed to be able to get the information and be more precise. You could come up with a reasonable assessment, but what we wanted to do, because these assessments, these demonstrations weren't a sort of, well, we'll have one here and one there. They were a constant drain on police resources. So it was important that we cover those efficiently as possible.
Can I just read a little bit more
Surely,
to you, and then
yes.
I'll ask you a question or two about it. The next paragraph: the more precise plans of extremists are normally supplied by special branch, who employ rather more discreet and sophisticated means of obtaining information. Occasionally, special branch obtains information from highly sensitive sources, disclosure of which would involve considerable risk to informants or seriously jeopardise future operations. Was that a slightly more oblique reference to
Yes, I use the
SDS?
word informants as
Yes.
because that is people's traditional perception of how things work. I mean, you can get information from 3 or 4 different main sources, and that would have all, dare I say, was considered back in '68, and we came up with the system that we did. But informants is a way of getting information, But informants is a broad phrase which is capable of other interpretations.
Are you able to help us with what other sources of intelligence were available to Special Branch at that time?
There were a few people who were informants, but not many. I think the trouble with informants is that some are excellent, but the loyalty of all of them isn't guaranteed. And of course the trouble is that if their loyalty isn't and the reliability isn't guaranteed, they also pose a risk to the operation as well, by definition, because that's you want people you can trust when you do, especially to get continuity on this sort of thing.
The SDS was, would you agree, the SDS was a relatively significant departure from more traditional methods?
Yes, it was a step further. There's no doubt about that, and it was the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign that had initiated that, if that's the right word.
And the longer deployments that we've mentioned necessarily involved a more significant intrusion into people's lives, didn't they?
Yes, yes. I think one of the things I would say, and perhaps you're coming on to this, is that the role of the SDS did widen slightly with, dare I say, some of the IRA campaign and all that sort of thing.
The question I really wanted to ask you is given that these things came along with the SDS's methods and the importance that you've mentioned in the previous paragraph of the liberal democratic system, was there any consideration that you can recall when you were on the SDS of whether the ends justified the means?
I think we almost approached it from the other way around in the sense, but I know what you're saying, but what we felt was that by having the SDS is that in fact demonstrations were more peaceable, things weren't allowed to get out of control, and so that it was almost a win-win situation. The extremists would get their publicity through the media. The people who were being demonstrated against weren't having a problem. The police weren't having a problem. The disorder, which was less. And so, in a way, that was the whole purpose of it all, it wasn't a question of like typical police undercover work, where the idea is to get 3 or 4 gangsters up before the Old Bailey, as it were. The idea was to do precisely the opposite, not to be arresting people left, right and centre, but to maintain public tranquility, which by definition meant there would be fewer arrests. So it wasn't a question of saying, well, get their plans and then we can arrest them all. It was quite the reverse.
I see. There's just one more little passage I'd like to ask you about
Sure.
in this essay, and then we'll move on. Just continuing from where we stopped. For example, it may be known that the International Marxist Group plans to hold a 6-man sit-in at an embassy, and knowledge of this is confined to a few trusted supporters. Clearly, if police are found to be waiting for the would-be participants, it would pose very serious problems for the source. Similarly, if the sit-in is allowed to continue, it might prove to be embarrassing politically. A solution is to acquaint uniform officers of the problem and to arrange for sufficient officers to be in the vicinity so that they can respond. Mr. Smith, was demonstrations that were embarrassing politically something that the SDS were concerned with stopping?
Well, yes, in the sense that obviously, whilst, dare I say it, we would expect Home Office, the Foreign Office, or British institutions to have a thick skin about these things. Obviously, if there were demonstrations outside foreign embassies and all that, you're now getting into more ticklish territory. You have to be a bit more careful. But the problem was, as I highlighted, was that if police are waiting for them when they turn up, then obviously there's a problem. But at the same time, if police aren't aware of it and they turn up 15 minutes later with blue lights, then there's a danger things can go pear-shaped, to use a phrase. So the ideal thing was for them to turn up gently 5 minutes later, and with a bit of luck, that minimised the risk of a problem. The demonstrators will get their publicity because they will probably have tipped off the press beforehand, so they got some nice photographs, and everyone was happy.
Just in terms of what you remember being of interest when you were on the SDS, would a small sit-in be the sort of thing that would have animated you or those above you?
No, they weren't particularly, but it depends upon the type. I mean, there would have been occasions, I think, when if it was so small and so, in a sense, insignificant that we wouldn't have told anybody. We said, look, no, this one we'll just let drift because it's not that relevant. It's outside, you know, the front door of the Home Office or whatever it is, and they're used to it anyway, and there's only going to be a few, half a dozen. They're not going to cause obstruction if they're on the pavement. So let's be common sense about this. It then poses less risk to our source, you know.
Thank you. If we could take that document down now and move on to tasking. You told us that before you joined the SDS, you'd been involved in C Squad, so
Yeah.
left-wing and public order issues, and you understood the area that the SDS operated in. Can we take it from that the groups, when you got to the SDS, were very similar, if not identical, to the ones that were of interest?
Very well.
To C
Yes,
Squad.
and yes. I would have known the main, because having been in Special Branch, I would have been aware of those groups generally anyway, without being on C Squad. In fact, I'd done protection duty prior to that for 2.5 years. But even then, you still were aware of these things because you needed to be.
Is it fair to say that the main difference really between the SDS and Special Branch more generally was the method being used to obtain the intelligence rather than the targets?
Absolutely, yes.
You told us in your statement that you weren't specifically involved in tasking UCOs, targeting them at groups. Are you able to help us with where these targets, the groups, would have come from within Special Branch?
So as I indicated, when I was involved in the right-wing section as the Chief Inspector, then I initiated coverage of that for a variety of reasons. And so one imagines that most of the targeting request, is the right word I suppose, would have come from C Squad, which was the primary area. I mean, Irish elements were also covered as well, and that would have come from another squad.
I see. We will come on to A8 in a moment, because you've given us evidence in your statement that a lot of C Squad's work was being done in turn for them. But just to focus in on something you've told us in your statement, you told us that you recall that people from Special Branch would come into the SDS office when you were there and say that they were interested in a particular person, and that you'd note down that request. Given that the SDS's interest, as you've told us, was public order, what type of information was being sought in these requests?
It's simply identification of the individual. We would have records on the primary people within these organisations. And also in parallel with that, the security service were interested as well, for obvious reasons. And so a chap would be doing a report simply to sort of check an up-to-date thing on this person and say, look, is he still active? What's he up to? If a lad was in that particular organisation, it made sense for them to come to us and say, look, can he help with this or not? He wouldn't ask any questions about this, but there's a very good chance that the man in the field would be able to say, yes, I know him, he's still active, no, he doesn't appear anymore, or whatever, and give a few bits and pieces of information about him.
How would that assist the SDS in their public order remit?
It didn't assist the SDS, it's just the SDS were able then to assist the branch in its overall picture of and indeed the security service.
So it was really a sort of secondary purpose byproduct,
yes, it
if
was,
you like.
they were in the right position to give the information, so why not?
How roughly, I don't expect you to be able to remember specific numbers, but roughly how frequently would requests like this happen?
A couple of times a week, perhaps.
Okay. And what sort of level of officer in terms of rank would be making these requests? Would it be someone senior to you?
The officer doing the inquiry, it would be inspector, sergeant or constable, DC, you know, just the one who was doing that particular inquiry.
And you would you simply pass these on to the relevant people, or would you send them up?
Yes, I mean, there would be, the file would be put in the bag, as we called it, with probably a slip-on saying, can you help Fred Bloggs on this one at all? And they'd know instinctively what they're saying. And they'd see the file. And in fact, of course, if the file went out to the officer at the safe flat, then he could then read it and say, yeah, he could see what had changed or hadn't changed in terms of what the individual was about.
Photographs of potential targets. How frequently do you remember those being given to UCOs in the field?
I don't particularly recall that. I know there was fairly significant coverage of demonstrations by people, but I can't remember photographs. I suppose it would have happened, but that's not something I particularly remember. No.
Can you help us with how photographs of people in the UCO's groups might have assisted them?
Sorry, the UCO's group?
Yes, so you've told us in your statement that occasionally you would take photographs down in the bag, I think you mentioned, to the officers in the safe flat. And what I'm interested in is to understand how this assisted with their deployment. I think what it was just part and parcel of the whole overall package, is that because we had a photographic department that would photograph demonstrations, so they'd have a whole album of these things. And obviously, it'd be quite nice they could look at those photographs and say, well, that's Fred, that's Harry, that's Joe, or whatever. And we may or may not have a photograph of that person on file. So you were then able to put a photograph on file of that individual. It just broadened your knowledge about that individual. I see. The security service you mentioned.
Yes.
Can we look at a document, please? It's UCPI 50030066. That's tab 6, sir. And it's page, thank you, it's page 2 I'm interested in, please. Mm-hmm. Thank you. These are minutes of a meeting which was held between the security service and a number of your superior officers and you, I think in fact you took these minutes. And paragraph 2, in terms of the purpose of the meeting, explains that the object of the meeting, as outlined by Commander Roger, that's Matt Roger, was to examine Special Branch and Box 500 coverage of extreme left-wing groups in London and to establish where such coverage overlapped and where it should be increased. Do you recall, Mr. Smith, whether such meetings ever led to a change in officers targeting or a change in where new officers might be targeted?
I don't recall whether there was any change, but all I can say is that that would have been a natural process. If you're both, as I say, looking at the same field, it made sense that you have some sort of awareness or coordination between you. And they might say to us, for example, I mean, I'm talking hypothetically now, or we're a bit thin on this ground, or we'd say we're a bit thin on that, and they say, so we've got that covered. Duplication wasn't a problem. It was when you had no cover. Duplication, in fact, turned it sort of 2D into 3D, if you know what I mean. So it was just a question of a courtesy thing that would have happened, I imagine, not all the time, but fairly regularly, to make sure that our targeting was appropriate and indeed coordinated.
Well, that brings me on to my next question, is how frequently do you recall meetings like this happening?
I don't particularly recall it, but my definition is I would have thought every 2 or 3 years or so. It wouldn't have been a sort of every 5 minutes job.
2 or 3 years, did you say?
2 or 3, I think so, yes. It wouldn't have been, because the nature of these organisations and the nature of the scene changing wasn't that rapid. Things sort of just drifted in. It's like animal rights. I mean, it didn't, in this period, animal rights wasn't featuring, but by the end of the 70s it was. And then over a period of time, it eventually disappeared, reduced, really, because animal rights achieved a lot of the things they wanted to achieve.
A question just about the administration of this meeting and perhaps others. We can see that minutes were taken of this meeting that you took. Were meeting minutes such as this always taken and kept by the SDS?
I don't remember having that many meetings. I mean, this meeting obviously took place, but beyond that, no, I don't recall. There would have been. There was the annual report, which covered the whole thing, which in a sense gave the people above the commander and the DAC or wherever a summary of what was going on, and so they were au fait with everything and up to date. But no, I think this was the only agency that we would have been dealing with. I can't think of any other agency that would have required such, needed such meetings.
I see. And can we take it from that internal meetings within the SDS, not involving outside agencies, wouldn't necessarily be minuted in your memory?
If there was something important, it would have been minuted, I'm sure, but not necessarily. I mean, it would be discussed. Trying to think of the whole thing ran itself in many respects. I mean, the organisation didn't change that much, and the product was coming through, and there wasn't. We didn't have chief superintendents knocking on the door saying, will you do this, will you do that, will you do the other? We knew what we had to do. We were covering the organisations, and that was it. There was the thing, I would say, run itself, but in many ways it did, to be honest.
Do you recall any element of socialising with MI5 before or after these meetings?
Not with MI5, no.
Thank you. Can we look, please, on page 3 at paragraph 7 of this document?
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to read it out, and it may be that you may or may not be able to assist us with this. Young Liberals and Redacted were other fields fields currently being examined by the I think it's OS. There's a reference to the SDS for their potential. MI5 expressed interest and offered any assistance from his department. The Young Liberals was a group I wanted to ask you about. Do you recall if this group's initial targeting was encouraged by the security service, or as this document seems to suggest that they were being informed after it had happened?
I don't remember the exact timing of it. All I can remember with the Young Liberals was that they were very much, the Young Liberals per se wasn't of interest, but there was elements within it were involved in anti-apartheid movement and all that sort of thing. Also, too, the Young Liberals, whilst they weren't anything like as extreme, dare I say, as the Trotskyists, they were an ideal stepping stone for someone to have a bit of street cred to then move on to it. Sort of like joining CND and having CND on your CV and then joining. Because you couldn't, in a sense, you're suddenly someone who's not interested in politics, suddenly you want to join IMG. Whereas if you have a bit of street cred and awareness and you've been in some other organisation, then it's a much better stepping stone to do that. So in part, the Young Liberals would have served that purpose, but also there was this element within the Young Liberals that were engaged in the anti-apartheid movement and some quite interesting demonstrations on that front.
You mentioned in your statement, and we know that an officer who we know as HN298, and you can refresh your memory of who that is. Could I ask you, Mr. Smith, just to put the folder on the side table you have, please? Thank you.
Yes.
That officer was deployed for some time into the Young Liberals.
Yes.
And you told us in your statement that you recall that he may have used that to move on to other groups thereafter.
Yes, yeah.
And I think we know that he later went on to anarchist groups and Irish support groups and later the Workers' Revolutionary Party. Is that the sort of movement that you are describing?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Finally, on this, Mr. Smith, was there any concern that you can recall within the SDS about a police officer reporting on the youth wing of a mainstream political party?
No, I think it was because we were interested in that one element, the element of the anti-apartheid movement. It wasn't the general, there was no interest whatsoever in the Young Liberals per se. It was just that there was an element of them that were involved in that. It was a transient thing. I think later on, the Young Liberals weren't so involved with it, and so therefore we never went back to them, to my knowledge. Well, I can't speak authoritatively, but what knowledge I have, that was the one time when we looked at that.
Can we take this document down, please, and replace it with another document? MPS 0729093. That's page 2. That's tab 10 of your bundle, sir. This, Mr. Smith, is I think it's called a minute sheet, which shows various comments on a report which was produced on the IMG by an officer. Can we scroll down to the second half of the page, please? Thank you. And you'll see at minute 2 comments by, I think that's Matt Roger, the commander, who says, "You will wish to peruse Detective Constable HN338's report, which I regard as quite magnificent, both in relation to content and presentation, for such a junior officer. It will certainly be eagerly grasped by the security service and doubtless keep their Trotskyist desk well occupied for months ahead." At one time, you will recall, IMG was a headache to police in regards to preservation of public order. Invariably, they were in the vanguard of any demonstration which bordered on violence and disorder. At present, they certainly do not pose any real threat in this area, and the future of the party as an active revolutionary body will depend to quite a considerable extent upon whether the differences existing within the leadership are resolved. and that is a comment made in June 1973 when you were within the SDS. Would you agree that that comment tends to suggest, at least, that the report in question was of more use to the security service than it was to Special Branch?
Yes, they were talking about there's a thing called tendencies within IMG, and there were 2 or 3 or 4 of these tendencies, and basically they were vying for power within IMG, and they were producing quite long documents about their subtle variations of Trotskyism or interpretation thereof. And so that was part and parcel of the power struggle that was taking part within IMG. Now, the politics didn't particularly bother SB, but obviously we passed it on to the security because it was right, in this, up their alley, as it were. That was what they wanted.
This report, which I don't need to take you to, came at towards the end of the officers' concerns
Indeed, yeah.
deployment, about 3 years or so. Do you recall whether officers' deployments were perhaps extended to serve purposes that benefited the MI5?
I don't think MI5, to my knowledge, didn't have any input in terms of how long an officer would be deployed. They were aware of the deployment because we were sending them copies of the reports, but that was entirely down to the officer concerned. The length of an officer's deployment was very much, he was the lead in that. Typically they were out, as you know, for 2 or 3 years or whatever. But no, it was the officer himself that determined that.
In your view, do you consider that MI5 influenced SDS tasking, targeting?
Influence is the wrong word. If they provide us information that was valuable to us in targeting, yes. But to influence, to say that they said, we would like you to do this, or, no, we made our own judgment. We might help them, obviously, but no, I think primarily we were interested in public order. It was obviously of interest or mutual benefit to know what we were doing or how we were doing it, but that was the extent of it, or no.
Thank you. So might that be an appropriate time for a short break?
Yes, it would. We will have a break of a quarter of an hour and then resume.
Thank you.
All rise, please.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Smith, can we turn please to processing of the reporting and how it left the SDS, if I put it that way. You told us that your primary duty was to process the handwritten reports which came to you from officers via the DI or the DCI. Other than handwritten reports, were there any other methods used in the SDS for passing intelligence on?
Sometimes by telephone, of course. If there was something that came through at the last moment, then obviously the passing of a written report wasn't practicable. So, but that was it was infrequent, I think, is to say that.
When you process these reports, are we right to understand that you didn't play a role in sanitising them?
No, I think, no, mainly it was just putting them into the format, tidying them up, as it were, getting them typed up by the typing board, which is right next door to us. No, I can't think, nothing comes to mind in that respect, no.
You didn't play any role in analysing what was in them, the content?
Well, I was aware of what was in them, obviously, and then I'd be aware that what needed to be expedited, dare I say it, or was routine. That was self-evident, and so obviously I acted accordingly as to what the information was.
The sort of more detailed analysis, rather than the role that you played, would that happen further up the chain within Special Branch, as you understood it?
Well, mainly the information, just put the information into the system, and then the system, the information would then go on to file, or be something that would contribute towards, obviously, a threat assessment or whatever. The information itself was just like another little brick in the wall. I mean, we're just adding to the wall of our intelligence.
The batches of reports that came to you, 15 to 20 or so, how roughly speaking, how long would it take you to go through a sheaf of documents like that and send them off?
It depends upon the size of the document itself. I mean, some of it just a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, I suppose, if that, and then another one, you know, might take a little longer, but it wasn't a great deal of time, no.
You've told us that once they'd come back from the typing pool, they were signed by the Chief Inspector, generally speaking, and then went to the relevant Chief Inspector in Special Branch, who would take action as necessary.
Yes, they would then minute it further, yes.
Right. And my first question is how did you know which Chief Inspector to send them
It
to?
was self-evident, because I knew which organisation was covered by which squad. And they were all just literally down the corridor from me, one way or the other, and I just walked them straight down them and give them a batch, usually, and say, you know, well, tell them what, they knew who I was, so they knew exactly what the reports were.
Yeah. What sort of action would you have imagined the receiving Chief Inspector to take on the intelligence
Well, a
you
lot
were
of it
passing?
would have been put on to just either the individual's file or the group file, as necessary. And in the case of stuff relating to specific demonstrations, would have been sent to or brought to the attention of the officers who were going to be involved in that demonstration. There's the man compiling the threat assessment, for example. So they could incorporate that, yes.
And the decision about how to send this on, is that the sort of thing that would tend to be included on a minute sheet like the one we saw?
Yes, exactly, yes. So they would say so-and-so to see, so-and-so to do whatever.
I see.
And it would sort of, yeah.
A8. You've told us in your statement that you possibly remember passing intelligence directly to A8 a dozen or so times a year, and that you would somewhat sanitise a report in order to protect its source if you sent it this way. Are we right to understand that that's because the intelligence was leaving Special Branch and going into the police more widely?
Yes, you had to be obviously more careful. You didn't want to do anything that would remotely run the risk of identifying the nature of the source. Well, not the identity of the source, but nevertheless you wanted to get that information across. I mean, I'll just give a hypothetical example. If you knew that something was going to happen, that 20 people were going to be at a certain place at 1 o'clock and they were going to be protesting about a certain thing, you may make the numbers less precise, you may make the time less precise, but the broad thrust of what you were saying was there, so that they were able to sort of, the uniform colleagues were able to keep an eye on things and be in attendance fairly at the appropriate time.
How did you know to do this? Were you instructed to do this?
It's just common sense, really. You knew that you could. I knew that A8 obviously needed to be told very quickly, so we'd do that, and you just instinctively do. You say, well, look, you knew what would obviously pose a risk to the officer. I mean, it usually would be obviously in the form of a telephone message, not a full formal SB report, where you've got names and details which would help in identifying where it came from and everything else.
You mentioned in your statement that, and I don't want you, please, to mention any names at this stage, that a special branch liaison officer was instituted at some point.
At some point, yeah.
Is it right to say that the job of sanitising was effectively taken out of your hands and put into theirs?
No, I don't think so. I think it was probably what the SB liaison officer was doing, in a sense, was helping A8 to sort of understand exactly what it is we were saying, because he would know, and also to help make sure that they protected our information and that they were briefed accordingly. I mean, what we didn't want was a uniform inspector coming up to a demonstrator and saying, oh, you were late or whatever. Well, it did happen on a few occasions, but obviously if we could reduce that to zero, as near to zero as possible, was to our advantage. I mean, which is what we wanted. And so he would have helped in making sure that our interests were served within A8, albeit that I think that the vast majority of the A8 people were aware of that anyway, but we needed a belt and braces approach because of the nature of the work.
We know, and you've given evidence that in your statement, that C Squad prepared threat assessments for A8, didn't they? Were these sometimes referred to as pre-demonstration assessments that you recall? Was that a term you recollect?
No, it would obviously, the first line would say this is a threat assessment regarding a demonstration or whether it's going to take place on so-and-so, but they were just called threat assessments, as I recall. It may have changed later, but
I see. Well, it may be that what we're thinking of came slightly after you left the SDS. The inquiry has also seen a document, an internal document from Special Branch, saying that in around 1976, so I bear in mind that this is a couple of years after you left, that C Squad were preparing between 600 and 700 threat assessments a year for A8. That's more than 10 a week.
yes.
Do you think that sort of figure is accurate to your recollection?
Well, all I can remember was that demonstration activity was pretty constant. There wasn't a weekend, barely a weekend that didn't pass off without a fairly significant demonstration, plus a horde of these smaller ones taking place. It was the nature of the political scene at that time.
So a number like that, perhaps in your time within the SDS, might not be wildly exaggerated.
No, it would be something along that order. Wouldn't surprise me, no.
And from your recollection, again, please no details, do you recall whether other special branch squads would sometimes feed into these assessments?
If it was the relevant organisation, yes.
And presumably SDS intelligence, would you expect that to feed into these assessments?
Oh yes, that was woven into it just naturally. I mean, as I said, the officers who were preparing the assessments would have been able to do the basic framework of that assessment and would have that literally written down ready as a draft. But what the SDS were doing were padding out the juicy bits, as it were, and giving us more precision on terms of the numbers and the likelihood of violence and any little action which was going to be different to the main plot, as it were. You were marching from, let's say, Marble Arch down to Trafalgar Square, if there was some target on way that they were particularly interested in, they were going to have a little sit down or a diversion to it, then that would be woven into the report.
And presumably, would you have expected that there would be some degree of sanitisation of SDS intelligence by the time it ended up
Yes.
in that document?
There was a natural level of protection and common sense used about that. You didn't give them chapter and verse, but you give them sufficient such that they can make an intelligent understanding of what was going on.
I see. Moving on to post-demonstration, after-demonstration reports. Was this done internally within the SDS, or was that a function of C Squad?
That was a function of C Squad, but what the SDS did was to contribute to that in terms of the people who had attended from the various organisations and any other little relevant bits and pieces which might add to the sort of the picture of or the report of the demonstration. But primarily it was the names of the people who'd taken part in the demonstration.
And when you say SDS, the SDS would contribute, is that by virtue of written reports, or would they meet in person with people from C Squad?
No, what would happen was that, generally speaking, this was on all the major demonstrations, I would be in the office, I'd go out on the demonstration, see the demonstration, come back just before the end, go back to the office. They would then phone in the lads who'd been out on the demonstration with their idents, as we call it. I would compile a list of those idents with the organisations that were responsible, they were part of, and that would then be given, and would be part of an appendix attached to the report by C Squad. And I mean, C Squad would have had a few idents himself anyway, and we would have been adding to that substantially, actually.
Do you ever recall a formal debriefing of UCO's officers after they had been on demonstrations? Again, no specifics, please.
Not particularly, no. I think that on the Monday morning, if there'd been a big demonstration, and on the Monday afternoon, then it's quite possible that the DCI and the DI would have had a group chat about it naturally and said, well, that went off or what. But there was most of the demonstrations, I have to say, passed off reasonably well. I mean, a few arrests here and there, but nothing along the lines. If you'd had something along the lines of the VSE demonstration, there was a coffins demonstration, I vaguely remember, in about 1980, which was rather difficult, to put it mildly. And a few others. But
just focusing on when you were within the SDS.
Yes, exactly. Within the SDS, I can't recall. There would have been, but I can't remember them.
There was a demonstration which didn't go off without a problem towards the end of your involvement in the SDS at Red Lion Square, in which a demonstrator called Kevin Gately was killed. Now, do you recall whether the SDS would have produced a post-demonstration report in the way that you have suggested after that one?
Red Lion Square rings a bell, and that's about as far as I can remember, to be honest.
Thank you. Well, if you can't go into more details, I won't ask you to. Thank you. Moving on to the volume, more generally, of reporting that came out of the SDS during your time. And now it's maybe a very difficult question to answer. Are you able to help us with how many reports, roughly speaking, per year or per month would be coming out of the unit when you were processing them?
I suppose in the course of a week there would have been 50 or so. I don't. Difficult to say. I mean, everybody would have been producing 3 or 4 reports a week, or perhaps more or less. At least a dozen officers. Yeah, I suppose 50-ish. But it's a bit of a guess, to be honest.
I won't ask you any more about it in that case. Are you able to say of a proportion of this, how much of that material went to the security service when you were in the unit?
I would have said somewhere around about 75 to 80%. We didn't send them the Irish stuff because national responsibility was for us in those days. So that would involve a couple of organisations.
That's fine, Mr. Smith, if that's your recollection. Finally, on this topic, feedback. You've told us earlier today that you knew that your intelligence effectively was of assistance.
Oh, yes.
But you mentioned in your statement that you didn't receive any feedback either from A8 or the security service. How is it that you knew that your intelligence was helping?
Oh, because of the, dare I say, the contact that we did have. The security service we didn't get any feedback from, and that I'm aware of. I didn't say it wasn't any. But with A8, certainly, I mean, what would happen on a major demonstration is a special branch officer would probably be in the control centre anyway on the day where they're masterminding the demonstration. And the relationship, I can remember, there used to be a security committee which was held at Chief Inspector, Superintendent, Chief Superintendent sort of level with the commander of A8 in the 80s, and I went to those as a superintendent.
If we could just focus on when you were within the SDS.
With the SDS, well, no, it was just common knowledge that the relationship was great and it was fine. I can't be specific about it.
Okay. Management, if I can. The inquiry, just generally, the inquiry has heard evidence from some of the officers who came just before you or in fact overlapped with you, that there was generally speaking a loose system of a management within the SDS. It wasn't particularly hierarchical as some other parts of Special Branch were.
No, would be.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, there was just the Chief Inspector and the Inspector. That was it. And, as I said, a great part of the support mechanism was, in fact, their colleagues.
Yeah.
So that, in a sense, was unusual. I mean, obviously, colleagues supported one another elsewhere in Special Branch, but in this thing, because of, dare I say, the ring craft that was vital to them, then that support, and indeed the fact that they were both in the same unique environment, was they knew what they were talking about when they were talking to each other.
You told us in your statement that you didn't have a formal pastoral role with the UCOs,
No.
but you consider yourself a colleague of them.
Oh, yes, yes.
And that you did help out ad hoc with management when required.
Yes, indeed.
And we'll come on to an example of that in a moment. One of the officers that was on the unit when you were there described you as an officer that we know as HN 294's number 2 in command. Now, can I just ask you to have a quick look at who HN 294 is, please? If you could keep the folder where it is, thank you.
Yes.
And one of the UCOs you managed described you as his number 2. Do you think that's an accurate assessment of what your role was?
Well, I was the next in the chain. I mean, there was only 4 of us in the office. There was the DCI, the DI, me, and then the DC. So it was a small structure.
Geoffrey Craft, who came after you, has told the inquiry in his witness statement that, in his view, the DSs in the back office were part of the management team.
Yes, yes.
And certainly your successor in the back office has said something similar.
Yeah.
So would you agree that you considered yourself part of the wider management team?
Yes, I mean, I was aware of what was going on and I could contribute, obviously, if we were all in the same office, so it was natural we spoke and there was no sort of know your place type of thing. We were all part of the same team, so it was a natural event, you know, that we chatted to each other about it. And even the DC would, you know, everybody's have a bit of input, you know. Wisdom isn't unique to the ranks.
Part of that interaction would have happened at the safe house.
Yes.
And you've told us that you were visited about once a month and sometimes a few more times a year on top of that when required. The purpose being that to take the bag down, as you've mentioned, but also, I think you said, to socialise with the officers.
That would be, yeah.
Now, is this happened on a monthly basis, roughly speaking?
Yes.
And this socialising, would it be a drink, a meal, something like that?
Meal, and then followed by some drinks. It was The Chief Inspector described it as a vino veritas session. It enabled them to relax because they weren't able to do that otherwise, as they would have done back in the mainline special branch. If they had something on, you know, with a few drinks, if they had a problem, people tend to be, dare I say it, a little more bold.
Well, I think on that point, you've told us that on occasion, these occasions, officers would sometimes speak their minds.
Yes, exactly.
Tell you what was going on.
Yeah.
And discuss problems, any problems they might be having. Do you recall whether this, again, no specifics please, but did this sort of thing happen often?
I think it was just as part and parcel of, yes, of what happened. It was the nature of it. Because I can remember the Chief Inspector saying something to the effect that this is a unique situation. We have to be more tolerant and understand why it is that this is so, because this is the only place they can let off steam. And I think it was a very valuable valve for that to happen.
And would that include what was going on in their deployments or their lives outside of the SDS, or both?
I think that probably what was happening in their lives outside SDS was probably more between themselves. Mm-hmm. Although, obviously, one knew some of these officers, I knew a few of these officers from before. So therefore, you knew to some extent their personal circumstances, because there was a sort of family sense, dare I say it, about Special Branch as a whole. Mm. But primarily, if there was discussion or anything that was interesting is probably the wrong word, but this was an opportunity if they had a problem to say it, and they would. They weren't shy, but that's what we wanted.
And that would include, would it, things going on in their deployments, problems, issues? Again, not specifics.
Yes. But if they wanted to, there was someone there. They would not necessarily to me, but someone else would probably know about it.
And if you had become aware of a particular issue that you had been told, socialising, that you thought your superiors needed to be aware of, would you pass it on?
Of course you would. Yes.
Geoffrey Craft has also told us in his statement that he doesn't consider that any police officers were more carefully monitored than the SDS, the deployed officers. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And in practice, was the socialising at the safe house, after the safe house, that in action?
That was an integral part of it all, yes. It was part of that process. I mean, what you had was a chief inspector and an inspector pretty well full-time looking after these guys, whereas, you know, as a DC on the squad, you may not have quite that same closeness. I mean, obviously there was a closeness, but it was just the nature of the work made it so.
I'd like to ask you about a couple of specific examples of things that happened while you were within the SDS. The first is the withdrawal of an officer that we know as HN 68. So if you'd like to have a look at the book.
Yes.
Now, we know that this officer was deployed in the Irish field while you were within the SDS. And you've told us in your statement that you recall that he was detained by the police at some point, we suspect probably in around 1974. And this all happened while your superior officers were away.
Yes.
So do we understand it then that you were effectively holding the fort while they were absent? And you were told about this and you had to take some action in response to it. Was the fact that you were being presented with this issue a surprise to you, or were you expecting to have to deal with any problems that arose?
Yes, it was just natural. I mean, I'd been in Special Branch then for, 13, 14 years, so I wasn't a rookie. And I knew the squad well, and so when this problem presented itself, I knew it was urgent, and I took it. I thought, well, I think we need to do this. Went and saw, I think, the appropriate chief superintendent. Well, we then went and saw the commander, and we all agreed, and that very day, the officer was withdrawn.
If your superiors had been there that day when the issue had arisen, do you think you would have been involved in it or not?
I may have been aware of it, but they would have dealt with it, and I'm confident they'd have dealt with it in exactly the same way.
And can you recall whether they were, when they did return, they were content with how the issue had been
Yes, I
resolved?
never had a moment of criticism. The only person who complained was the individual himself, but 10 years later he said it was the best thing that ever happened to him, but that's another story.
I see. Another issue I'd like to ask you about is the withdrawal of 3 officers which took place at the beginning of 1973. If we could bring up a document, please. MPS 0728975. And it's page 5, please. Now, the top of this, I should explain, Mr. Smith, is the annual report for 1973 from the SDS. And paragraph 18 reads, the unfortunate appearance in the extremist field of and the gist says, a member of the public necessitated the immediate withdrawal of 2 women detective constables. The loss of knowledge and expertise when a long-serving officer is permanently withdrawn is serious but unavoidable if the stringent demands of security and the officer's best interests are to be served. Now, Mr. Smith, we know that that is a reference to an occasion when 3 officers, in fact, were withdrawn, and I'll give you the numbers if you'd like to refresh your memory. It's HN 348.
Yes.
HN 45.
Yes.
And the third is a name I can tell you, it's Jill Mosdell.
Yes. Yes.
Now, I'd like you, please, to answer my next question, just yes or no. Given that you were involved in the SDS at this time, were you aware of those 3 individuals being withdrawn from the field?
I might have been, but I don't. I can't recall it.
Is it the sort of thing, generally speaking, that you would have been likely to have been aware of at the time?
I would have thought so, yes.
Can I take it from that you can't help us with the circumstances surrounding?
No, the only thing I can say is that 2 of the individuals were in the same organisation.
Yes, well, thank you. Can I also take it then that you can't help us with any visits which may have occurred from very senior officers to one of the people concerned to discuss what had happened?
No, I can't. No.
Thank you. Now, the SDS, you have told us in your statement, left a safe house, one of the safe houses that was used, around 18 months or so after you joined the unit, due to a security concern. Now, 18 months or so would take us to around the middle of 1972, roughly speaking. And we know that these officers were withdrawn at the beginning of 1973, so a few months thereafter. And we've also heard from you in your statement, and there is some evidence that at around this time, early 1973 or so, the SDS procured a second safe house. Now, again, a yes or no answer, please. Are you able to help us with whether these 3 officers being withdrawn led to a change in the practice regarding safe houses?
No.
Do you, generally speaking, remember your views being sought about officers being withdrawn from the field? And no specifics, please.
No.
You mentioned a little earlier that you attended demonstrations as part of your job in the back office. Was this for the purposes of intelligence gathering, or was this just to keep an eye on the officers who were there?
It wasn't necessarily intelligence gathering. It was simply if you saw the demonstration that the lads were involved, and you could get a better understanding of what was happening and what they were saying. it was it put it into 3D, as I would say.
Recruitment of officers. One of your successors in the management structure of the SDS, Angus McIntosh, recalls that back office sergeants would play a role in recruitment, making recommendations particularly. Was that something you ever did?
No, no.
Would you ever be asked for your opinion on someone? No specifics, please, but whether they were suitable?
I can't remember that happening, no. I mean, I probably would have contributed to it, but I can't remember being asked it.
We know that 2 officers were recruited to the SDS just as you were leaving the unit. One is called Rick Clark, was called Rick Clark, and the other is HN 300, if you'd like to just have a look.
Yes, thank you.
The inquiry has heard evidence that both of these persons, in slightly different respects, had reputations within Special Branch, one for womanising. Was that a reputation that you were aware of when they joined the back office?
Not at that time, no.
Did you come to learn about it afterwards?
Oh, 10, 15 years later, yes.
If someone had been recruited to the back office with such a reputation, would you have done something about it?
Yes, I would have said it. I don't think it's advisable.
Do you have a view now, or then when you were in the SDS, about what sort of people were or were not suitable for undercover work?
Yes, I think you needed volunteers for a start, I think, because then obviously the person was willing. If you ask a junior officer to do something, then he may feel he's being coerced. And that avoided that. But yes, because you knew the officers, you knew those that were better than others. I mean, one had a view of most officers. Yes, I think so. I would have certainly said that certain types of individual weren't suitable for it. You needed those with a sort of a balanced, calm disposition.
Undercover identities, please. You've told us that you don't know how undercover officers created their identities when you were...
No, that was something that was dealt with by the individual...
Well, sorry. I'll just ask a question about it. At the time that you joined the SDS, the evidence that the inquiry has received suggests that undercover officers made up names that they used. However, by the time you left the unit, October 1974, officers were obtaining details of deceased children, normally from Somerset House, to support their undercover identities. Given your role in the back office that you've told us about, and your role as colleagues to these people, can you help us with what led to this change?
No, I don't remember, no.
Is it right that you... Sorry.
All I could say was, I think, in hindsight, speaking to just one officer many years later, he said that his problem had been he hadn't got a proper identity, and that had led to a problem. So I suspect that he had a problem, and that was part of the reason why he had to leave, and that may have been part of the trigger process to go for a more secure system.
But
I don't know that.
You don't recall that at the time?
I don't know that to be a fact.
So can we take it from that you don't recall any discussions with officers?
No. That was all dealt with within the individual and the chief inspector and the inspector.
You weren't included with the conversation with the chief inspector or the inspector?
Yeah, they would give them advice on what to do and what not. And I think that would have all happened that obviously happened, and the only people who would have been involved is those two and the individual themselves.
Do you think, looking back, that it's likely or possible that the decision to change the policy, if I can call it that, would have been taken at the Chief Inspector level or higher within Special Branch?
I don't know. It was possible. I don't know. I don't know.
Were you aware at the time of a criminal case involving a person who had used a deceased person's identity influencing this decision?
No.
Were you aware of the Day of the Jackal book
Yes.
coming out?
Yes. I
Are you aware, and the film thereafter, are you aware of that influencing the decision to change the policy?
was of this period of time, I can't be sure, but I do remember the Day of the Jackal and that system being sort of mooted. It's a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, and I can't remember.
I'd like to ask you about a specific officer, HN 200, please. So if I could ask you to have a look.
Yes. Thank you.
HN 200 has told the inquiry that he was told by someone in the back office to go to Somerset House, and in fact that person went with him to show him what to do. Now we suspect that HN 200 joined the SDS in around April 1974.
Yeah.
So when you would have still been
one of the
within
later
the-
ones, as I recall. Yeah.
Can you help us whether that person was you or not?
I can't at all. No.
Can I ask you whether you recall HN 200 mentioning to you or within your earshot that he was upset at the prospect of using a deceased child's identity?
No, I can't remember anything of that. No.
More generally, can I ask you, please, what your attitude was to finding out that undercover officers had used the identities of deceased children?
Well, I must confess, it's difficult to think of a better system. That was the problem, is that you could, if you made it up and falsified it, then the trouble is that the people who were, if they had occasion to check on you, would quickly establish that it was false. Whereas at least if you had someone that had existed, at least they had a chance of being successful. So I think it was a sort of the lesser of two evils, dare I say.
The next topic, please, is sexual relationships. You've told us that they were, in your statement, that they were wrong and foolish, would have posed a risk to undercover officers and the squad, and you mentioned the effect that they would have had on the other party.
Yes.
Is that still your view?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Was that your view when you were within the SDS?
Well, to be honest, at that time, nobody spoke about that as being a potential problem. It was only in hindsight, back, 2013 or so, that I became aware of that. But it obviously was a risk, you know.
Within your statement, you suggest that there may be a distinction in your mind between a one-night stand and between a longer-term relationship. Do you consider that one-night stands between officers and those they're reporting on would be less problematic?
Well, there's degrees of culpability or whatever you would call it, but I mean, obviously, they were both wrong. Some were more wrong than others. It's as simple as that. But frankly, I think the criticism would be, levelled at whatever you did in that respect. I mean, it was wrong, full stop.
In terms of what the manager's response to finding out if this had happened would be, you suggest that a one-night stand would give rise to serious consideration of the deployment being terminated,
Yes.
and that longer-term relationships would certainly result in a termination of the deployment. The question that flows from that is it possible, conceivable in your mind, that an officer who had had a one-night stand and who his managers had found out about it would have been allowed to continue on his deployment?
There would have to be wholly exceptional circumstances for that to happen. I can't, it's difficult to think. If someone was just on the point of getting some very, very important information, possibly, and that it was of a terrorist nature or something perhaps, but it's difficult to think of anything.
But can we take it from that you would consider the starting point for finding out that any sexual contact had happened between an officer and someone they were reporting on would have been that they were withdrawn?
I think so, yes. And I'm pretty certain that would have been the case, yes. And I would have supported that view, yes.
The inquiry has heard some evidence that shortly after you left the SDS, there was what's been referred to as banter within the safe house amongst officers and some managers about sexual activity between officers and those they were reporting on. Was this something you ever heard when you were in the safe house?
Never heard anything remotely about that sort of thing.
Were officers, when you were on the SDS, ever questioned directly about whether they were having sexual contact with those they were reporting?
I don't know anything about that at all, no.
Do you consider with hindsight that they maybe should have been?
I would have thought it was common sense for them not to do it without having to be told. As I said, we had these sessions monthly when people, vino veritas, and even in those sessions, I never heard it mentioned.
Do you think it's possible that those above you within the chain of command, the chief inspector and inspector, might have turned a blind eye to things like this happening when you were on the SDS?
Well, if they turned a blind eye, they never discussed it in the office. That's what, so, and since we were in that same office for great lumps of time, a great deal of the time, then it would have been odd if it wasn't mentioned, if that had raised its head in some way.
Is it the sort of thing you would have expected to have heard
I would have
about?
thought they would have said something, yes. I mean, obviously you don't tell everybody absolutely everything, simply because that's the way of life, but I don't think they would have sat on that information. It would have been in part of general chat, if that had happened, I would imagine.
Final topic, please. Arrests of officers. You've told us that today that the risks of arrest came up when officers were on demonstrations.
Yes.
And I think you said in your statement that UCOs, undercover officers, knew not to get involved with crime, the document we saw earlier. How much of a concern was it amongst you and the other managers about your officers being arrested and possibly even ending up before courts?
I think in practice it was a question of experience. The numbers of officers, there was always the risk because of obstruction, but the numbers of officers that were arrested was probably less than the fingers of one hand, or no more than the fingers of one hand in a period of, 4 years that I was there. And bearing in mind the number of demonstrations they went on and everything else, that was statistically it's almost inevitable that 1 or 2 would have been. But provided it was just obstruction and they were part of a large... If they had been arrested for obstruction on their own, that might have been a different issue. How come you've been arrested and no one else has? But if they're part of a group of 20 that were just swooped up because they chose to sit across a road or something, then that was part and parcel of the risks of doing the job. You couldn't do the job, dare I say it, without taking that risk.
Courts, how much thought, if any, was given to officers appearing before courts in their undercover identity?
I think it was dealt with on an individual basis, obviously, what happened. But if they were just arrested for... I could only think of one particular incident, and on that occasion the idea was that just plead guilty and leave it at that type of thing.
When these issues arise, and we will look at an example in a moment, was the security of the SDS as an operation a concern amongst the managers?
Oh, yes. I mean, obviously, it was the potential existed for, dare I say, a uniformed police officer or someone else to recognise the man, as a police officer. It's a minimal risk, but it still existed, and therefore you had to be alert to that possibility because things would then have to happen in a hurry.
Would you perhaps suggest that the security of the SDS was considered a paramount concern when officers were arrested?
Oh yes, I mean obviously you have to be very much aware of that. I mean the individual and the whole unit thing would potentially, if things just fell wrong, could create a tremendous problem which caused the collapse of everything.
Would that potentially be put above the danger of an officer misleading a court?
Well, it's on the same level, I can't see that there's officer wouldn't, I would hope, but misleading a court by having a false identity, I can see what you're saying.
Yes.
I think that was to that end, that was inevitable. I mean, if the first time an officer is arrested for obstruction, he has to put his hands up and say, I'm so-and-so, well, the squad will might as well disband straight away. Because how could it continue? Because it's a balance. And I think that's the way it was.
Can we look at an example
Sure,
of that,
yeah.
please? It's in relation to HN298, who you can have a look at. And while you're looking, please, can we bring up document MPS 0526782? That's
Yes.
tab 8 of your bundle.
Yeah.
Sorry, the document itself rather than the open ground schedule. The document is MPS-05-26782. It's not the open ground schedule, but the document itself. Thank you. And it's page 13 we'd like to look at, please. This is a report which you prepared, I think, of a first appearance at a magistrate's court in relation to the officer we know as HN298, who used the cover name Michael Peter Scott, that we can see within that page. Do you... You authored this document, I think. Were you asked to attend the magistrate's court by your senior officers?
Yes, I would have been, yes.
Can you recall whether they were particularly concerned about HN298's arrest?
I think it was just a standard procedure that obviously if he was going to appear in court and someone needed to be there in case something happened at the court which the officer himself wouldn't be in a position to report immediately back. So I was there to see that... dare I say it, if the wheel came off, that we knew it instantly.
Do you remember whether you spoke to HN298 before you attended the court, or can you not?
He may well have been aware that I was going there, but I don't recall speaking to him, no.
Was there also an aspect of you being there for moral support?
That would have been incidental, but the primary reason was to find out what happened at court and to be there on the day. But moral support would have been a sort of a bonus, dare I say it.
HN298 appeared in the real name of another person.
Yes.
Was the fact that he was appearing in a court in another person's name a concern, as you can recall, to the managers of the
No, I
estates?
can't remember him talking about it. I think obviously it was just a hope that the whole thing would, pay his fine, and that would be the end of it, full stop, hopefully without any other complications.
We can likely infer from at least the court appearance that you attended, and there were later ones that I don't think you were at, that HN 298 answered the charge in his assumed name.
Yes.
And that it is therefore likely that he was in fact misleading a court as to who he really was. Would you have seen it that way at the time?
No, I didn't, no.
With hindsight, do you agree that that is problematic?
Yes, I suppose it is, but as I said, that was the problem with the nature of the squad. If that was, it was inevitable that occasionally an officer would be arrested for obstruction, and therefore, if that was going to happen and we were going to put our hands up straight away, then the squad wouldn't exist. It was as a balance of, as I say, it was the better for the greater good, as it were, by far. It wasn't as if there's a question of degrees. I mean, there's a difference between someone driving 34 miles an hour on a 30-mile limit and killing someone going at 150 miles an hour. It's that sort of comparison that I suppose I'm making. But technically, I agree. You're saying it's misleading the court. I don't deny that. Obviously, one can't.
Can I ask you to just look at another section of this document? It's page 8, please. And this is a report that was written by HN 294, who was your superior. If you want to look at the list to remind yourself who that person is, please do.
I think. Yes.
And he wrote this: the decision on which I should be obliged, and I think that's a decision for those superior to him, for your guidance is whether DC HN 298 should continue his attempts to learn more of them. To do this, he will probably have to apply, as they are doing, for legal aid and attend meetings with all those arrested to discuss tactics. Whilst I am reasonably confident that DC HN 298 could, with assistance, carry this off, there is, of course, the potential of embarrassment to the police if his true identity should ever be disclosed. Alternatively, he could disappear from the political scene. Both are technically possible, but if the latter decision is reached, we would lose intelligence coverage of what in the past has been a troublesome area of the public order field. Would you say that sums up the attitude of those within the SDS at the time to incidents like this?
Well, first, I can't remember this particular aspect. Just let me quickly read this again, I'm sorry. Yes, I think it's broadly true, yes.
Really, what this is suggesting is that the primary concern of HN 294 was for HN 298, the officer, to maintain his cover, and secondly, to avoid any embarrassment to the police. That appears to be what's being suggested. Do you agree?
Yes, I think the choice of the word embarrassment is probably, I may have used a different word or a different phraseology there.
Yes, well,
but
you didn't write this, so I'm not
it.
asking you to answer for it. Finally, would you agree that certainly in this small extract there doesn't appear to be much thought given to whether HN 298 was being completely honest with the court when he appeared?
There wasn't, no, not in the extracts we've seen, no.
Thank you. Do you recall whether there was any change in guidance or instruction after the prosecution of HN 298?
No, I don't.
Finally, would you agree that it's fair to say that arrests were considered an occupational hazard, really, of being...
Yes, I think I've explained that before. It was, statistically, it was going to happen. In many ways, it was remarkable. It happened as few times as it did.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Now, there are two small matters I've been asked just to clarify with you in your evidence earlier, and then you'll be pleased to know that's likely to be it from me anyway. You've mentioned that there were files that were sometimes taken down to the officers
Yes.
in the safe house by you. Would these be registry files, group files, or both?
To my knowledge, they were all individual files.
So those would be registry files.
Yeah, well, registry. Yeah, they would have a reference on them, and they would be files, but they're files for the individual rather than an organisation. But they were, all the files were registry files or SB registry files.
Yes. And would they be files that were requested by the officers, or would you sort of proactively provide them for possibly relevant people?
The officer who was dealing with the inquiry into that individual, which was on the squad, that person on the squad, would bring the file to me, and then I'd put the file in the bag, probably with a note to the relevant officer in the field to say, can you assist? And you know, either say yes or no. That was it.
Thank you. And finally, this. I asked you questions now a little while ago this morning about the guidance that you gave officers about not getting too involved with individuals within the groups. Where, in your mind, did this come from? Did it come from your superiors, or was this simply as you saw it sort of common sense?
I think it was part of Ringcraft. I think there was lots of little things that you didn't ask questions. You didn't get them. You know, it is part and parcel. See, the less you volunteer about yourself, the less chance they're going to ask questions. And if you ask questions, you draw attention to yourself. So it's a sort of reciprocal thing which improves your own protection, as it were.
But would you have understood that from those around you or from your superiors?
I just knew it anyway. I mean, one of the nice things about being a policeman is from the very first day, you're given advice. A bit like the very first day I walked out on the bit, a man said, if you go into a pub, don't go in on your own. Wait till the lights of the blue van come down the road, and then go into the pub. It's that sort of thing you get constantly within the police, and you build up your knowledge and your experience. And it's an active. One of the great things about the police office is that's a continuing process. And by then, you knew instinctively what to do or what not to do.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much. Those are the only questions I have for you.
Mr. Smith, because your evidence has taken a little longer than we'd timed,
Sorry.
would it inconvenience you if you were to come back here at 10 to 2? You'd be content to do that?
Of course I can, so yes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to improvise here. We're going to have our... there may be further questions of you which are fed through our system. We allow 20 minutes for it for a variety of reasons. I'm going to allow that to happen over the lunch break, and we will start again at 10 to 2. We're going to hear from Mr. Creamer, we hope, at 2, or at any rate very soon after 2. Until 10 to.